Hello, so in this video, I'll explain how I built a Kubernetes job scheduler API using FastAPI. The idea is to expose Kubernetes jobs through the REST API so user can trigger batch workloads without directly using kubectl. I have already explained what is a Kubernetes job and what is Kubernetes cron job. So let's go ahead. So let me give you a high level idea of what the system does. So here the API runs inside the Kubernetes. When a user calls the this route of jobs endpoint, the API creates a Kubernetes job. Kubernetes then takes care of the running the actual pod. The API never creates pods directly, it only talks to the Kubernetes API server. So let me first explain the flow. So first it is the user, the curl. So first when we apply the curl command, so which is curl exposed and the URL which we can see, so what it means and what it does. So from our we are an external user and we are applying this curl command, so we are sending a normal HTTP request. We have no Kubernetes access right now, we only know this URL. At this point the Kubernetes is hidden from the user. The second point we can see it goes through the Kubernetes service. I have already explained what is Kubernetes service and how it is working in here, and it is also similar in project one. You can see that. I'll attach the link here. So it goes through the Kubernetes service first. Our request hits service. So what service will do here, it acts like a stable virtual IP. It selects the pod using labels, forwards the traffic to a healthy pod. What important thing here is the service does not run the code, the service does not know the business logic, it only forwards the traffic. So from call our URL, it goes to the service and to some pod. As we can see in the API service YAML, the type is service and the job scheduler name is job scheduler API, and in spec we have selector. So how this is how it finds the pod which has job scheduler API, and our target port is 8000 and our service type is node port. So the service forwards traffic to one fast API pod. Inside the pod, UVCon is running fast API receives /jobs route and our Python function executes. The pod is just an application container. At this moment, no job exists yet. No pod for the job exists yet. Only application logic is running. So as we have mentioned our image in the deployment file and loaded, so now it goes through the our Python application and it will start executing the docker file. So in docker file first it will go through the app.py file. So let's see it. To summarize till now, we hit the URL, it goes to the service and the service routes the request to a pod created by deployment, and the pod simply runs the fast API application code. So before moving on, we understand this that service only does the networking part, deployment only ensures pod exists, pod already pod already running before request, and fast API executes like a normal app. So next in the app.py file, it finds the route post /jobs and then it goes for create job function. So first in this function batch v1 is equal to get batch client. This function is executed. So what this function is for? So to connect to the Kubernetes cluster, this function is here. So it says give me a Kubernetes client so I can talk to the cluster. So let's jump to the function get batch client. So this function's responsibility is to configure authentication and return a Kubernetes API client. So here line in try config.load in cluster underscore config. This is a most important line. What it means? It means I am running inside a Kubernetes pod use in cluster credential. So what load in cluster config function actually does? Internally, Kubernetes does this for every pod. It mounts file at where run secrets Kubernetes and service account inside the folder token, which is identity of pod, CA cert, cluster certificate, and namespace is there. So this function reads the service account token, reads the CA certificate, reads the API server address, and stores them in a memory for API calls. And this function only runs inside the Kubernetes. If we run it outside the cluster, it fails. So because that folder doesn't exist and no service account is mounted. So one question I had, and you might also be having, to that how does this config dot load underscore in cluster dot config function works, and how it connects to our cluster. Currently we have not done anything about Kubernetes. It is just a Python code. So let's see this. So answer for this is Kubernetes connects to our application itself automatically. Our code just does is opts in. So first Kubernetes prepares everything before code runs. When Kubernetes creates a pod, it does this extra work automatically. Inside the pod, Kubernetes does these things. First, it injects environment variables, which is Kubernetes service host and port. For example, host is 10.96.0.1 and port is 443. This is the Kubernetes API server's address. Second thing it does is a mounted folder. Kubernetes mounts this path inside the container where run secret Kubernetes IO service account. Inside it, there is a CA cert, cluster certificate token, identity of this pod, namespace, which namespace the pod runs in. So we did not create this, we did not configure this. Kubernetes did it automatically. So what this function config dot load underscore in cluster underscore config really does? This function does only three things. First one is finds the API server. It reads the Kubernetes service host and port. So now it knows the Kubernetes service host port. It loads the second thing, it loads the authentication. It reads the file where in the path of where run secret kubernetes.io secret service account and token. This token says I am this pod, I belong to this service account. And at third step it does is load trust certificate. It reads the file where run secret kubernetes io service account ca.crt. This ensures TLS connection, no MITM, secure cluster communication. That's it. This is how this function works. And lastly, let's see the written statement. Written client.batch v1 API. So first, what is client? So in the first import command, we have written from Kubernetes import client. So this client is official Kubernetes Python client library. Think of it as a Python wrapper around the Kubernetes REST API. So Kubernetes itself is just HTTP APIs. For example, we can see post API, batch v1 path, namespace, default job, this path. We normally call this using curl. The Python client saves us from the writing the raw HTTP. And what is batch v1 API? So Kubernetes groups APIs by resource type. So pods, resource and pod API groups. Pod is of API group core v1. Services are of API group core v1. Deployments are of group apps v1. And jobs and cron jobs are of group batch v1. So the line client.batch v1 API, it means that give me a client that can talk to the jobs and cron jobs APIs. So what this object actually contains? This written object has methods like create namespace job, list namespace job, read namespace job, delete namespace job. Each method maps to a real Kubernetes REST API call. Example, batch v1 dot create namespace job. Internally, it becomes the post API batch v1 namespace default jobs. So where does it know where to send the request? So we already ran config dot load kubernetes in cluster config function that configured global client settings like API server URL, auth token, and TLS cert. So when we do return client dot batch v1 API function, it automatically uses the cluster API server, the pod service account identity. We don't need to pass the host port or token manually. Simple analogy is think of it as a cluster config.load in cluster config. It is a login and client.batch v1 API. It opens a job dashboard. Or even simpler, the load in cluster config function, it connects to the cluster, and batch v1 API, it chooses which API group to use. So what this function does is it ensures that the user is authenticated inside the Kubernetes and then give an object that can manage the jobs. So batch v1 API is the Kubernetes client interface for interacting with the job and cron job resources, internally translating method calls into the Kubernetes REST API request. So now in batch v1 variable, we have a ready to use Kubernetes jobs client. It is already connected to our cluster. It is already authenticated using service account. Nothing has happened yet. No job is created yet. So the next is for the batch underscore v1 dot create namespace job. So namespace is equal to default, body is equal to job. This is the first real action. So what this function does is think of it as a send a request to Kubernetes API server to create a job. So internally this happens. Python method is called, HTTP post request is called, then Kubernetes API server is called, and then job is stored in etcd. Actual API endpoint called is this. So what is body is equal to job? This is very important. Earlier we built this object job is equal to this. So that job object is Python version of job YAML. So when we pass body is equal to job, we are saying that create this job definition in Kubernetes. So what happens inside the Kubernetes after this? So once API server accepts the request, job object is created, which is stored in etcd. Then job controller notices it. Then job controller is always watching for new jobs. Job controller creates a pod using the pod template we have defined, and pod runs the container, which says hello from our API job. Then pod exits and job is marked as succeeded. So to summarize this, that after initializing the batch v1 API calling the create namespace job, it sends a request to the Kubernetes API server to create a job resource, which is then picked up by the job controller to spawn a pod and execute the workload. So here actually I am showing the output of the application, what it does. So here we have triggered the batch workloads without using the kubectl command, and this job runs at every 2 minutes without executing any command. So when we run this command minikube service job scheduler API, and when we hit this URL, so we have this URL and it shows status. Then we hit the jobs, it shows the job succeeded or not, failed, active, and its status. And when the most important thing, when we do the call exposed and hit this URL, it shows us that job is created, and job name it shows that API job. So when we do the kubectl that pods command, it shows us this job. So this is the pod created by job, and here is the pod created by cron job. So as we know that cron job creates a job and job creates a pod. So this is the pod executed, and we can see that this pod is created every 2 minutes. When we see the later output of the Kubernetes get pod, it here is show that hello cron job is executed at every 0 minute, 2 minute, 4 minute, 6 minute. So this is shows that our application is working. Here also we can see that kubectl get cron job command shows us the our cron job, and here we have defined the schedule that it should run after every 2 minutes. And here we can see in kubectl get job that API job is shown, and here it shows completed, and here cron job shows completed too. Yeah, so that's the idea. So that's it. So if you like the video, please do like and subscribe.